take a look at exchange rates now. First up is always definition. Your exchange rate represents a rate or a price at which you can purchase a unit of a foreign currency using your local currency. So for example, 15 Rand 70 cents for $1. Next step, perspective. How should you be looking at this? For a lot of topics, perspective is important, but for this topic, perspective is really important. All right. How do I want you to look at this? I want you to look at this as if you're an investor. You're a South African citizen who's considering investing in the United States economy. All right. The biggest restriction is you can't just turn up into the US economy and decide that you're going to invest your rands or you're going to make a purchase with your rands. In the same way that you cannot come from the United States and decide to enter one of the popular retailers in South Africa and buy a good with your dollars. You need to convert your rands to dollars to invest in the US economy. You need to convert your dollars to rands to invest in the South African economy. Now, with this perspective, we have two questions that come up. What is it that could cause me to want to invest in the South African economy? What is it that could cause me to not want to invest in the South African economy?
For this topic, it's not only important to keep in mind what sort of perspective is required of you, but it's also important to keep in mind your examiner's perspective. So what are the potential approaches that your examiner might take when looking at this topic? Firstly, you could get given a graph. With this graph, you have to analyze and interpret it and draw a conclusion about the exchange rate. What does it mean when the exchange rate increases? What does it mean when the exchange rate decreases? Second approach, you could get given a scenario but without a graph. And with this scenario, you have to draw the exact same conclusions. Does the exchange rate increase or decrease, and what does it mean? Keep in mind, it doesn't matter what the approach is, it is highly recommended to sketch a graph anyway. In fact, always sketch a graph, increases your accuracy, and it saves a lot of time. Now that you know that you have to draw a graph, let's look at how should you approach these graphs when we're looking at exchange rates. The moment you see a graph, you have to go straight to your y-axis, and you're looking at the currency that's on the right. In this case, your pounds. Everything about this graph becomes about pounds. So when we put our curves in there, we've got our supply of pounds, we've got our demand of pounds, the two interact, and they give us our equilibrium exchange rate. It's important to focus on the idea of pounds because we've got two important questions to ask. What is it that could cause my supply of pounds to shift? What is it that could cause my demand of pounds to shift? We'll start off by looking at the idea of your pounds increasing, your demand of pounds increasing. So a movement like this. Your demand goes from D0 to D1. And as you can see, your equilibrium exchange rate goes from E0 to E1 as well. All right. But before we look at what are some of the things that cause demand to shift from D0 to D1, let's look at what does it actually mean when demand goes from D0 to D1. And that is the idea of appreciation and depreciation. If our demand moves from D0 to D1, equilibrium exchange rate moves from E0 to E1. That is known as the appreciation of your pound, the depreciation of your rand. What that means is that previously you only needed E0 rands to purchase a single unit of your pounds, but now you need more rands to purchase a single unit of your pounds. The opposite movement, if we move from E1 to E0, say if your demand were to decrease, that would be an appreciation of the rand and a depreciation of your pound. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the reasons why your demand would increase, your demand would shift from D0 to D1. What are some of the reasons that would cause your demand to increase? Remember from our perspective section, we said, in order for you to invest in the British economy, you would need to be in possession of pounds. So when we ask the question, what is it that would cause your demand of pounds to increase? We're actually asking the question, what is it that would cause you to want to increase your investment in the British economy? So an example would be something like if your Bank of England were to increase interest rates from 10% to 15%, you would increase your investment in the British economy so that you can capitalize on that increased rate of return in investment. If your domestic prices were to rise, for example, you'd find that goods are relatively cheaper in the British economy, so a rational individual would go on and buy those goods from the British economy. But remember, To make investments or to make purchases from the British economy, you need to be in possession of pounds. Hence, we'd have an increase in the demand for your pounds. If you speculate or expect your pound to appreciate, to understand the idea of speculation, let's put some numbers to this. E0 and E1, if we say E0 is 4 Rand a pound, and we expect in 2 months the exchange rate to be at 8 Rand a pound, what you would do is you'd buy a pound right now for 4 Rands, 4 Rands for a single pound, and in 2 months you'd sell that pound for 8 Rand. So you'd land up with 100% return on your investment simply because you speculate in appreciation of the pound. If you expect higher profit opportunities from the British economy, this is very similar to your interest rates increasing. If you expect a higher profit opportunity, it means that if you invest in a British company right now, because they make a higher profit, they make a higher return, you'd also make a higher return on your investment, which is why it's very similar to your interest rates. Lastly, if you have regulation, which changes and makes it easier to invest in the British economy, makes it easier, makes it cheaper, you will increase your demand for your pounds. But again, going back to your perspective section, it's important to understand that when you increase your demand for pounds, when you buy more pounds, you need to do something with your rands. You're exchanging your rands for pounds. So let's look at the flip side to your rands against your pounds. That'll be looking at a graph which maps out your pounds against your rands. So yes, by focusing on our y-axis, the label on your y-axis, you find that everything on this graph is about your rands. So when you increase your demand for pounds, what is it that actually happens to your rands? Your rands, there's your equilibrium exchange rate, there's your supply of rands, there's your demand of rands. When we increase the demand for your pounds, what we find is that we have an increase in your supply of your rands. In order for you to buy pounds, you need to supply your rands to the market so that you exchange them for your pounds. And if you look at your equilibrium exchange rate, it goes from E0 to E1. This, you can break it down and you can analyze it further, confirms the idea that your pound will appreciate and your rand will depreciate. Remember, with our demand and supply graphs, we've got two questions to ask. What is it that could cause our demand curve to shift, and what is it that could cause our supply curve to shift? We've looked at the demand question. Let's look at what is it that could cause our supply curve to shift. What is it more specifically that could cause our supply curve to increase? First step, we look at our y-axis. So in this case, we're back to looking at your rands against your pounds. So everything's about quantity of pounds. Let's map in our demand and supply. There's our equilibrium exchange rate, and our supply increases, which is this movement right here, and our equilibrium exchange rate decreases. And from this movement, we can conclude that there's an appreciation of your rand and a depreciation of the pound. Let's look at the aspects that could cause that shift. So what are the reasons that could cause S0 to become S1? First example, if the Central Bank of South Africa were to raise its interest rates, we'd find that individuals would much rather invest in the South African economy and pull out their funds from the British economy. So remember, in order for you to invest in the South African economy, you need to invest using rands. Those rands you'd purchase using your British pounds, which is why we have an increase in the supply of your British pounds. Another example, if we have lower prices in South Africa, things are relatively cheaper in South Africa, so individuals will come and buy goods here, which means we have an increase in the supply of your pounds as individuals look to buy rands. Again, if we have a speculation or an expectation of the rand strengthening, we've looked at the speculation example, same thing would apply. Try and see if you can put some numbers to that. If we have an expected higher profit opportunity in South Africa, again, similar to your interest rates. And lastly, if we have regulation change, which makes it easier to invest in South Africa, makes it cheaper to invest in South Africa, we'd have an increase in the supply of your pounds. When we looked at the demand example, we noticed that there's always a flip side to your rand against your pound graphs. So in this case, it'll be a pound against your rand. So start off by looking at your y-axis, and yes, we realize that everything about this is about your rands. So now let's map out our rands. We've got our demand and supply of your rands, getting our equilibrium exchange rate right there. And what we're asking is, when we have an increase in your supply of your pounds, what happens to the demand and supply of your rands? We increase our supply of pounds so that we can invest in the South African economy, so that we can buy rands. So obviously, that's mapped out by an increase in your demand for your rands. And as you can see, your equilibrium exchange rate moves from E0 to E1. And yes, this again confirms the idea that your pounds would depreciate and your rand would appreciate. Having understood what an exchange rate is, what it is that causes your exchange rate to shift, and what does it mean when your currency appreciates or depreciates, let's look at some of the theoretical and practical applications of this exchange rate. First up is the idea of your purchasing power parity of money, your PPP. Now, your purchasing power parity of money dictates that after converting a dollar to rands, the rands will have the same purchasing power in South Africa as the dollar did in the United States. Mathematically, this shows that your exchange rate of your dollar per rand is equal to the cost of goods in the United States over the cost of goods in South Africa. Next up is your exchange rate regimes. We have three exchange rate regimes: floating, fixed, and crawling peg. The floating exchange rate regime, that's the exchange rate regime we've been dealing with in the examples we've looked at. Your floating exchange rate regime is a free market. So the central bank allows the demand and supply to interact and establish the equilibrium exchange rate of E0. Your fixed exchange rate regime, however, the central bank comes along and decides that E1 should be the prevailing exchange rate. Remember, in your balance of payments, we looked at the balance of payments being a combination of your current account, capital account, and your financial account, and your central bank reserves. Your central bank will either increase or decrease its reserves in order for the economy to attain this exchange rate right here. Your crawling peg exchange rate is the exact same thing as your fixed exchange rate, except that the exchange rate has a time path. So the central bank will decide that the exchange rate should be E1 in 2 months, 6 months, a year, whatever the central bank deems to be necessary. Last section, the fourth and final section of this, the interesting part, what you need to know. First thing, most obvious, you need to know your graphs. What do you need to know about your graphs? As always, start off on your y-axis. Next, you need to figure out, are we shifting our demand or supply? All right. After having established that it's demand or supply, are we increasing or decreasing demand or supply? And after that, we draw the conclusion, do we have an appreciation or depreciation? Second thing you need to know, if you don't have a graph and you have some sort of scenario, make a quick sketch, saves a lot of time, increases accuracy. Purchasing power parity, know your equation and know how to manipulate the equation so that you find the missing value. And if purchasing power parity doesn't hold, the exchange rate changes up until it holds. That's all for this section. Good luck to everyone. Ciao.